Seth is doing a series on Jesus. He wasn't sure how long it was going to be. But so we were going through some songs, and there was one that I was going to try on a Sunday morning, but I wasn't sure if we knew it. And so we've not sung it for a while, and so we'll try it tonight. Kaya's shaking her head, so it's fairly easy. It's fairly easy tune. I think you might. We'll try it first. Jesus, meek and gentle, Son of God most high, pitying, loving Savior, hear thy children's cry. Pardon our offense.
All right, as promised, no official stopping point tonight. Actually, I added a stopping point, apparently. It didn't have a stopping point at first. I don't know how it got there. Yeah, it didn't this morning. I guess I was on autopilot this afternoon and put it in there. Still not official. That's the unofficial stopping point. But we do have an official starting point, and that's chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, verse 2 to be exact. I guess the second half of verse 1. Verse 1 is kind of split in half in the ESV. Chapter 25, 1 Samuel 25. Probably should just recap verse 1 again because it's going to come into our text here. Samuel died, and Israel mourned for him. That's the whole funeral verse of Samuel. Samuel died, and he was buried, and people were sad about it. That's pretty much all the Bible has to say about Samuel's death. But it's very significant, or it will be, in about 3 chapters or so. So just file that in the back of your minds that the prophet of God of this time has died. David, still on the run, the fugitive, he goes down to the wilderness of Paran. Just pop this map up that we had last week. And he sends his servants to the house in Maon, a man whose name was Nabal. He was a very rich man. David sends his servants there asking for hospitality because David, formerly, they helped out Nabal's servants previously. So he wants to be repaid with the hospitality, for what he showed his men, his servants. And Nabal refused. The messengers come back to David, and David has a moment here. It's a very un-David-like moment. David says, all right, all of your men, or all of you men, put on your sword, and we're going to ride down to Nabal's house and kill every male. Doesn't sound like David, does it?
Yeah.
It does?
Well, he's protecting his men. David's not protecting himself. The guy just refused to show hospitality to his soldiers.
Okay.
So
Where's that in the law, though? Thou shalt not kill unless they disrespect you.
Well, I think people expected hospitality first, and rejection not expected. I mean, that's what people
Yeah,
at the town
that's true.
square. People were nicer back then, I think. And if you weren't nice back, kill them.
Okay. Well, I'm not following here, but people were nicer back then, but if they're not nice to you, kill them. That's what we've heard here. Well, the Jews were very hospitable people. And, you know, as a rule, I think they still are as a people. Maybe not all Jewish people, even over here, you know, but there is a reputation for hospitality. But, I mean, was Nabal right? No. But was David's reaction right? No. And he's gonna admit that whenever somebody helps him to snap out of it. Did you have something, Jay?
Well, I was just thinking, you know, the Edomites wouldn't let Israel pass through.
Yeah.
And so that for that, God held them accountable for generations to come.
Yeah, God did. Later on, He did. I mean, it was brought up many times.
But it was probably more of a military thing.
Yeah, I think that was that was God judging them for that. In this case, there was no threat. I mean, David was not in danger. His men weren't in danger. this was just a real stinker of a man who, after this kind of treatment, I wouldn't have wanted to go there at all. And David and his men should have just said, fine. I mean, David normally, the kind of spirit he would have about this is the Lord will repay him for what he's done here. I mean, God, Jehovah, will make him answer for this. He'll be held to account. But we're not really given a whole lot of information, so we don't know if it was the stress of the situation, which is very possible. I mean, he probably was under a lot of stress on the run like this, and with Saul seeking his life for no reason whatsoever, no good reason. But David, this was it sounds like Saul almost. I mean, he sounds like Saul. Mm-hmm.
Well, when David went to war during this time, was there any good reason to kill other people? He
Well,
wasn't getting land. The land had already been given. He even went with the Philistines at one point. So David was a man of war.
yeah.
I think that's the way he answered everything. It's hard to explain, but I think there is such a thing as a gentleman's war.
Well, David's war, I don't know what you would call it, his expeditions in war were, pretty much sanctioned by God. He fought against Israel's enemies, and, kind of like during the Judges period, Samson was killing Israel's enemies, and that's what they did. And that was a more or less a holy war, as it might be called today, directly sanctioned by God or approved of by God, because the people they were fighting against were people that shouldn't have been there in the first place. I mean, they should have already been dealt with. In this case, we're talking about brethren, kinsmen, but, more or less, but there's no cause for any of this. I mean, this is just a man who disrespected him and his men, did not repay his help with hospitality. It was shameful, no question. Shouldn't have done it. The man was a Calebite, so he was his brother in that way. But a servant of Nabal goes to his master's wife, Abigail, who becomes the hero of chapter 25. Abigail was nothing like her husband. She was discerning, which she's about to prove. She makes haste to prepare a very extensive gift for David and his men. And she goes and convinces David to change his mind about killing all the men. David then says about Abigail, he praises her and says in verse 32, he says, "Blessed be Jehovah, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me." So he thanks God and praises and thanks Abigail because Abigail saved him. He said, "Blessed be your discretion and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt." Now, when David killed Goliath, did he bear any blood guilt? No. But if David had killed Nabal, he would have had blood guilt and all his people. He would have brought on guilt on himself. What was he going to be guilty of besides shedding blood? Working salvation with my own hand. Now, what was the whole reason why he had refused to kill Saul? Other than he was God's anointed. But Saul was pursuing his life. But if he had killed Saul, he would have been working salvation with his own hand, in a way. But now that's what he was about to do in this case, and Abigail saved him. This is why I mentioned this morning, with the, hypothesizing about Jonathan and David. If Jonathan had been with David here, I don't think he would have got in this mess. I don't think Abigail would have had to have saved him, because Jonathan probably, in my opinion, he would have saved him before. He would have talked sense into David and said, David, let's slow down here. And you would think somebody would have said that, but we have, 400 men of war here. They're kind of used to this kind of thing, and maybe they weren't stopping to think, or maybe it was not their place to question, they thought. But anyway, because David chose not to avenge himself, but instead to leave it to God, guess what God did? He avenged David for him. 10 days later, Nabal, the fool, that was his name. His name meant fool. Probably he had a reputation for that. So that name was given to him. He died. Verse 38, 10 days later, Jehovah struck him. About 10 days later, Jehovah struck him and he died. So now he blesses God for avenging him. Jehovah has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. And Abigail saved him. The bad news is that David joins the polygamous club. Not a great club to be a part of, but he joins it. He takes Abigail and another woman, Ahinoam of Jezreel, as wives. And back in Jerusalem, his original wife is now given to another man. So he gets 2 wives and loses one.
And God was still with him through this, even though God isn't necessarily condoned this?
Yeah, polygamy was definitely not an ideal situation. And it seems to have been one of those things that God winked at during this temporary time. Just like Jesus explained about divorce, he said the reason that God put the certificate of divorce into the law of Moses is because your hard hearts. And, there was going to be a time when that would not be the case anymore. From the beginning, it wasn't that way, and it's not going to be that way now. I think polygamy was one of those things also that God just overlooked, and the time would come. It wasn't that way from the beginning, but it also wasn't part of the law. Mm-hmm.
My friend that's a Muslim said, and I think he was dealing mainly in Old Testament thought, women had no way of making a living. David just killed her husband, which basically left her uncared for. So it wasn't a sexual thing, it was more of an economical thing,
Yeah.
is the way he explained it.
We don't know if it's sexual or not. It says she was very.
Well, that's what I'm saying, the
You're
Muslims say.
very beautiful, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking, why wasn't, I don't know how many wives he ended up having, how many hundreds of concubines he had.
Yeah.
And he took, Bathsheba. I've never understood.
Yeah, I've never understood any of that, to be honest, with anybody. But other than the political aspect, that part makes sense, which I think explains Solomon's. Why do you have so many wives? Well, with every one of these wives, he gains an alliance. I'll marry this woman. Now I'm married to her family. And I'm married to her family. And so Solomon had allies everywhere because he was married to so many different women. And they were probably all strategically chosen. In this case, it may have been that, now she's a widow, so he takes her as his wife. Who knows? The text doesn't say. Again, it just reports the facts and leaves it at that. But I could imagine, somebody that is in favor of polygamy would come up with some kind of explanation, well, it's not sexual, it's economical. Sounds pretty slick to me, He probably, you could use that to the women too, Oh, don't worry, it's not sexual, it's just economical.
But they didn't choose spouses like we do.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything, it was arranged. I mean, even though God, the person had to be dead, but can you imagine being the wife in a Jewish household? If her husband dies, she has to marry his brother so that the lineage goes on. I mean, we just don't think like they did back then. So that's why it's hard to understand.
Yeah, it's hard for us to put ourselves in.
In the Jewish community.
Yeah,
It's
commanded,
ask
I mean.
Lord that question.
Yeah. Unless the brother's really good looking, then I guess it's not that. It's easier then, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, but the situation in verse 44 is going to come back up later. It's recorded here. It kind of transports us back to, wherever they were, I guess Jerusalem still, where Michal, David's wife, is given to somebody else. Sort of like when Samson left and, they gave his wife to somebody else, and that didn't go over too well. Well, now in chapter 26, an episode that's extremely similar to the one in chapter 24 occurs. The Ziphites come to Saul at Gibeah and say, hey, David's hiding in Hachilah again. Wants to show you where he is. So here Saul goes up with 3,000 men to seek David out there. He's encamped there. They're at their encampment or whatever. David is in the wilderness. He remains there. And he finds out that Saul had come after him, and he sent spies there. They find the camping place, and he and Abishai sneak into the camp where Saul is sleeping. Okay? He's sleeping there. He's lying there. And you might think that's pretty impressive. They could sneak in there. Here's an army of men, the king of Israel, an army of men, and they are sneaking in here? Well, we learn what's going on here is that God made a deep sleep fall on them in that camp. So David says, who wants to go down with me? It's Abishai. Stands up to the task. Here they're standing right next to the king, sleeping like a baby. And Abishai says, deja vu. This is a gift from God. Here's Saul's spear, his famous spear, that he's so keen on throwing at people, sticking in the ground. That's why they'd sharpen the butts of their spears. Remember when it said that, can't remember if we've gotten to that point or not. I guess I can't remember, to be honest. But when Asahel chased Joab, and he said, I don't want to have to kill you. And it said he stabbed him with the butt of his spear so that it went all the way through him. Well, that's because they would sharpen the butts of their spears, stick it in the ground. That's how that happened. Well, that's what's going on here. His spear is just sticking there. Just anybody could grab it. David could certainly grab it now. And he's got him right there. He's in an even better position than he was when he was in that cave relieving himself. David, still not having it. He refused. Saul is Jehovah's anointed, period. I will not do it. I'll leave it in God's hands. Again, he says, if God wants Saul to be killed, then God can kill him. Now, if Jehovah told David to kill him, that would be a different story, but he hadn't. So he says, if God wants him dead, God is more than capable of doing it. So instead, they take the spear and the jug of water that was by his head, and they leave. And when they get far enough out, they holler out again and they say, hey, look what we got. Just like he did before with the corner of his robe. And Saul, it's the same thing. Except I can't help but think Saul might be a little less trustworthy in this case as far as his sincerity, because his word didn't prove very important before. So now, why would we trust him now? Well, he still said, I will no longer seek to harm you because you've saved my life here. gives the spear back, and goes. Saul and his men go, David goes. Well, like I just pointed out, David did not trust Saul this time, whether he trusted him the first time or not. He didn't trust him now, so he says, there's nothing better for me than that I should go to escape to the land of the Philistines. So now he's going to go back to the Philistines in Gath again. He arises, goes up with 600 men. Now the first time, if I remember right, he didn't have any men with him. He runs away the time that he had to act crazy, slobbering, spittle in his beard, and it worked. Now he shows up at Gath with 600 men with him. And the king of Gath gives him Ziklag. Say, hey, you can go and, this can be your place where David and his men are going to live. I think this is it here, number 9. Here's Gath. Here's Ziklag. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's right. I should have labeled them a little better than that. So they have Ziklag. Now David was going to go, he stayed here, by the way, almost a year and a half, a year and 4 months. So a year and 4 months passes by with David and Ziklag. They lived there in the territory of the Philistines. He goes around with his men and raids in the southern portion there. And Achish knew about it, the king of Gath, and he'd come back and he'd say, where'd you raid today, David? You don't get any good raids. This whole time he thinks that David's raiding Israel. But what he didn't realize was that David was not raiding Israel. He was raiding the Canaanite people in that area. But he just let him believe, that that's what he was doing. He would tell him where he raided, but not specifically who he raided, although he was pretty borderline deceiving, naming the Kenites and the Jerahmeelites and people like that. But anyway, that's what he was doing for a year and 4 months. He was living there among the Philistines, raiding Canaanites in the area there in the southern portion of Judah, southwestern portion. Achish trusted David, thinking, boy, he's really made himself stink to the people of Israel. He's really turned his cloak. So he'll be my servant forever. He's mine. David is turned. He is truly mine. Now, it says, in those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Well, you can probably already see where that's headed. David's going to get between a rock and a hard place here. But first, it says Saul, really here he goes ahead and says, by the way, that you got to come fight with us, right? We got to go fight Israel, and you're coming with us. David said, okay, I'll make you he says, I'll make you my bodyguard for life. I'd probably want a guy like David to be my bodyguard too, especially when he got his mighty men with him. Read about some of the things they did. You'll never find any warriors better anywhere. But Achish, that's their little plan. Now we're told again that Samuel had died. We're reminded here. Now Saul sees the Philistine army poised for battle, and he is terrified. And he needs some divine guidance. I need to figure out what I got to do. What am I going to do? Samuel's dead. So Saul inquires of Jehovah himself, but guess what? He didn't pick up the phone. He's screening Saul's calls. He didn't answer him by dreams. He didn't answer him by the Urim. And he didn't answer him by prophets. He's got nothing. So now he's in a panic. And he resorts to the abomination of divination. He goes to a woman who's a medium. What's a medium? Everybody knows what a medium is, right? It's not a small and it's not a large, it's a medium. Well, why are they called mediums? Okay, a soothsayer.
It's a connection between living and dead.
All right, a connection.
Between living and
Yeah, think about a medium. Medium is between a small and a large, right? Well, a medium is between, I guess, essentially, two worlds. That's what they would claim. Living and the dead. Medium. Whether you can talk to the gods, spirits of any kind, dead people, angels, I guess, maybe, gods. That's what a medium was. She was a witch, basically, a soothsayer, sorcerer. Well, we're also told not only that Samuel had died, but that Saul had put out the mediums and necromancers out of the land. But now he's going to go to this medium because one of his servants said, hey, there's a medium over at Endor. So he disguises himself, he goes there, 2 men with him, and they come to her by night, and he says, divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. Now the woman's very clever. She says, surely you know that King Saul has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. She's smart. She's a professional. What has she just said? He comes to her. He knows that she's a medium. He knows what she is. But she says, don't you know that Saul, in other words, why do you think I'm a medium? Don't you know that Saul cut off all the mediums? So how could I be a medium? How could I do that? How could I be one of them? Because there are no more in the land. It's kind of like you ask about the mafia, and there's like, there's no such thing as the mafia. Everybody knows that. What are you talking about? There's no such thing as the mafia. Well, she's like, there are no soothsayers. Saul got rid of them. Well, he swears to her, and he doesn't just swear to her, he swears to her by Jehovah. Nothing's going to happen to you. Apparently that was enough. Maybe that shows you just how serious swearing by Jehovah is. That was enough. She says, all right, who do you want? Why do you think I'm a medium? There are no more mediums. Don't worry, nothing will happen. Okay, who do you want? He said, Samuel. Now, there's some irony going on here. Saul didn't have a tendency to listen to Samuel very well whenever he was alive. He didn't follow his advice very well, did he? Now he's dead, and he suddenly wants him back.
He obviously didn't realize he should have.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the wisest things, other than the sorcery part, but wanting Samuel's advice is one of the smartest things he's thought of so far. But this is where, it's almost humorous, because this woman was a fake. I don't think there's any doubt about it. There's no such thing as contacting the dead. There's no way to contact the dead. There is absolutely no way to do that. You cannot do it. There's no phone number. There's no hotline. There's no secret recipe. There is absolutely no way for anybody on this earth to contact somebody who is not on this earth except for God, and there's only one way that you can do that. And it's not the way that the necromancers and diviners do. But we learn here a very interesting thing that happened. When the woman saw Samuel, for the first time, it seems, ever in her lifetime, somebody that she was supposedly going to contact showed up in the room. And when she saw him, she screamed. That's what I would have done, and that's what she did. She cried out with a loud voice. She was probably normally all calm, cool, and collected. She also realizes that this is Saul. This is the king. How did she find out? No clue. But she did. He asks her to describe the man. He figures out, this is Samuel. Samuel's pretty grumpy about the whole thing. He says, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up here? I don't want to be here. I finally got to leave this place. Now you're dragging me back." He says, "I'm in great distress. Philistines are coming at me. God has turned away from me. He won't answer me anymore. So I've summoned you to tell me what in the world I'm supposed to do." Samuel says, "Well, if this is what's going on, why are you asking me?" But notice how this is a very important statement he makes. He says, "Why do you ask me, seeing that Jehovah has departed from you and has become your enemy?" That's pretty strong language. Jehovah has become his enemy? Now, I thought God loved everybody no matter what. I knew that Jehovah had departed from him in that special way, but his enemy? Yeah. Is it possible to make God your enemy? Well, apparently you would think by this verse, but we don't have to rely on this statement in the Old Testament. James said something similar to this. James 4:4. He said, "Anybody who seeks to be a friend of the world makes himself" what? The enemy of God. So, yeah, you can be the enemy of God. Saul had become the enemy of God. When we refuse to obey God's will, based on Saul's example, he becomes our enemy. Samuel says, "I told you this was going to happen, Saul. Nothing is happening here except exactly what I told you repeatedly that was going to happen, because you didn't obey the voice of God. You didn't obey Jehovah's voice." He then tells him, Israel's going to fall in this battle. The battle's already lost, Saul. Sorry to tell you. Sorry to break it to you. You're going to lose this battle. Israel will fall, and worst of all, Saul and his sons are going to die. So there's the bombshells. I guess a few. Jehovah has become your enemy. He reminds him, Jehovah's departed from you. Jehovah's become your enemy. Israel's going to fall to the Philistines in this battle, and you and your sons. Why is that so sad? Because of one of his sons, at least one of his sons, who went by the name of Jonathan. He's one of his sons. So this is very bad news to the reader, because I don't think there's anybody who could possibly read 1 Samuel and not love Jonathan. And yet, this is a very sad revelation. Saul falls at full length, it says, and was dreadfully afraid and weak because he had been fasting. Finally, he eats something, and then he and his men leave. Now, chapter 29 again, we're back to David on the other side. The princes of the Philistines gather together. They're all gathered at Aphek. That's here, number 10. So here they are. They're gathered together. They don't want David and his men around. So what are these Hebrews doing here? Isn't this David? Achish said, "This is David we're talking about. He's been with me for days and years. And since he has deserted to me, he hadn't done a single thing that I have found to his fault." They said, "You got to send him back." Because you know what? If David, he's been here for a while, and there's something special about home, and it may be that David's been looking for an opportunity to go home, but he can't because he's kind of in too deep. Now, what you've done is you've not only presented him with a wonderful opportunity to be able to go home, but you've also put him in a tough spot. You've cornered him. If he didn't want to fight his people, now you've cornered him, and he's got to make a choice. And this can be his ticket back home safely. You know how he could pull that off if he wanted to? David's got a free ticket home now without having to worry about consequences from the leaders of the Israelites. You know what all he's got to do? Kill these guys. That's it. Look what I got. Can I come home now? That's what they were afraid of. He's going to carry our heads back, and he's going to be a hero again. So Achish says, his hands are tied. David, sorry, you got to go home. You got to go. He gives him apparently what was the compliment, the highest praise and compliment in Hebrew culture. He says, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Highest thing he could have said, apparently. But David goes home, or he leaves them. And whenever they get back to Ziklag, he and his men find out or see that the Amalekites raided the place, burned it to the ground, captured the people, including his 2 wives. This is terrible. He and his men weep, the text says, until they had no more strength to weep. They wept until they had no more strength to weep. Guess who they blame for this? They blame David. It's your fault. And they talked about stoning him. And now it's back to Moses and Aaron all over again. Let's stone these guys. Let's stone David because they were bitter in soul. They were torn up. But David strengthened himself in Jehovah his God. Very interesting statement. David inquired of Jehovah, should I go and attack these guys, these Amalekites? God says, go and you'll restore everything that was taken from you. All that was taken, you will recover. So he takes 400 of his 200 men. 200 he leaves at the brook there to watch the stuff, or to watch the stuff that they had. And 400 go up. On the way, they find this Egyptian in the open country who hadn't eaten or drank anything for 3 days and 3 nights. He said, I'm a young man of Egypt, and I'm a servant of the Amalekites. I got sick and they left me here. Left me here to die. David said, take me to the band of men that raided Ziklag. And so that's how they ended up getting there. Struck them down, recovered all that they had taken, including his 2 wives. What did God promise him that he would recover? All that was taken. Verse 18 says, David recovered all that they had taken. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. And then some, really. And by the way, the 200 men that were left behind they were chosen to stay behind because they couldn't go on any farther because of their travels. When they get there, the 400 said, these guys don't deserve anything. Because they didn't go with us, we're not giving them any of the spoil that we recovered. That's what they said. Which one said that, by the way? Verse 22. The wicked and worthless ones. That's very telling. The wicked and worthless fellow said that. That kind of attitude and spirit, that's a good description of it. Wicked and worthless. Only a wicked and worthless man would think like that. David said, oh, no. What Jehovah has given us, you're not going to do that with it. So they're going to get the same thing that we get.
Those 200 that were there, they had been doing things though. Like they were part of the army, like they had been fighting. Right? They just didn't go on this particular mission.
Yeah, they didn't go with them there.
It's weird that those guys said that. It's not like they were just lazy bones. They were
Yeah.
They were part of the military.
Yeah. They had been with them. But they said, hey, they didn't take part in this particular fight, so they're not getting any of the spoils. And David said, trying to find says, who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage.
Both jobs are important.
They shall share alike. That's a good leader right there. That's the kind of man you want as a leader. The one who stays behind. See, he gives them a little more credit than they deserve even, because that's where I misspoke a second ago. They stayed back because they were too exhausted to cross the brook, they said. But he made it out like they had a role in this. It was an important role. And again, that reminds us of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 12 about those members of the body that we deem as less honorable. We bestow even more honor on them, and they're indispensable. That's what David said, and he made it a statute and a rule from that day forward. Now, very quickly, the Philistines fighting against Israel. And this is where the prophecy comes. They pursue them. I meant to mark this a long time ago. We're already past Endor, but that's where Endor is. And the battle is happening. It says in verse 2, the Philistines, chapter 31, overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan. There it is. Just not a word of warning. Just boom. We're told that Jonathan is killed and doesn't even stop to give us time to process and think about it. Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua, the sons of Saul, battle pressed hard against Saul. The archers found him, and guess what happens when the archers find you? Nothing good. They shot him. He was very badly wounded. He says to his armor bearer, you got to end my life. Put an end. Thrust your sword through me. Thrust me through with it so these Philistines can't take me and mistreat me. I mean, he's not wrong. It's not bad reasoning. Much better to have a quick end than what they might do. But still, the armor bearer, apparently thought the same as David did. He would not do it. He said, "No, I'm not going to do it." Of course, the king in his state, it may have been easier for him to tell the king no in these conditions, but at any rate, he would not do what the king said. So then Saul falls on it, his own sword, I guess the first sword he could find himself, falls on it. And then his armor bearer sees that, and he does the same thing. He knew that, he's never going to get out of this now. So he falls on his own sword. This is just a tragic and nasty end. It's like Shakespeare. Saul died, and his 3 sons and his armor bearer, all on the same day. Israel is going to be torn to pieces. The whole royal family in one day. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. Now the Philistines come and live in those cities. Not a good day for Israel. Well, the next day, talk about mistreating. The Philistines come up there where Saul had gotten to. They find him there, and his 3 sons fallen on the mountain. They cut his head off, stripped his armor off, and carried it through the land to the house of their idols. They put his armor in the temple there, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Just nasty business. But then we see some heroes. The inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. When they heard what the Philistines had done, very bravely. They went all night to retrieve the body of Saul and the body of his sons. Again, a nasty business, physically, literally. It's not anything I would want to do. Far from it. But they did it under no obligation, out of respect and honor for these men, their king and his sons. They take the bodies down and burn them, and they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So these men, unnamed men, are heroes, valiant and brave. That was probably a risky business. Not very long ago, the enemies had fastened these bodies there. They could have easily been still around. But that was a disgrace, and they went and they got those bodies, and they honorably disposed of them. And they would be appreciated for, even to this day, I guess. But it doesn't end there. Chapter 1 of 2 Samuel picks up right where that left off, and David's going to hear the news. So it's a very dark day for Israel, but it's about to get brighter. It'll take some time to get brighter because David, like we said before, David doesn't just immediately become king and everything gets happy again. But as often happens in a nation where a monarchy exists and the royal family is gone or the king is killed, civil war erupts. And the battle for the throne and all that mess. That's what is about to happen, but God will still be with David. And David is going to grieve, obviously, even for Saul. We know he'll grieve for Jonathan, but he's even going to grieve for Saul. And he'll avenge Saul if he finds out anybody had anything to do with it, as we'll see. But, Lord willing, we'll look at that next week. If anybody here needs to respond in any way, you have that opportunity, and you can do it as we stand together and sing.
Washed in the blood of Calvary, cleansed and made whole, salvation free. There on the cross he purchased me, down beneath the blood of Calvary. Washed in the blood of Calvary, I've been redeemed. He set me free. Once I was blind, but now I see. I'm washed in the blood of Calvary. Love was the key that won my heart. Redeeming grace He did impart. Raised now to live eternally, singing praises to Him for Calvary. Washed in the blood of Calvary, I've been redeemed. He set me free. Once I was blind, but now I see. I'm washed in the blood of Calvary. I think everyone was here this morning, so there's no one that needs the Lord's Supper. Any news that we need to be made aware of between this morning and this evening?
Autumn crawled a little bit.
You got a call?
No, Autumn has started crawling.
Oh, she's crawling. I was going to say she was calling. It's like, wow. Whoa. We have a medium, I think, no. But